Hi, my name is Josh Kasparik, and in this podcast, historical perspective podcast, I wanted to take a look at the Seahawks' history of ownership of its coaches and the eventual rise and championship that was brought with the arrival of Pete Carroll and John Schneider. Before you consider Paul Allen, the owner, the man who eventually pulled the trigger on bringing in Pete Carrol and John Schneider, one has to go back all the way to 1988. The team had just been sold by its consortium of owners, the Nordstroms, whose patriarch, Lloyd Nordstrom, had signed the original franchise rights in 1974 to bring the Seahawks to Seattle, though tragically he would never see a single down played in a Seahawks uniform, as he would die of a heart attack April of 1976. The family would keep the team for 11 years, but fundamentally believing that following two strikes, that the structure between the players and ownership was broken, they looked for a buyer and found Ken Behring, a real estate mogul out of California. Now, at that time, there was a 5-month waiting list for season tickets. It was quite hard to get a Seahawks ticket in Seattle in 1988 when Ken Behring became owner, but it took about 7 years of a series of bad decisions and what he considered himself, Ken Behring, being ownership decision, had whittled away an offense to the point of uselessness, run off its only successful coach in Chuck Knox, and proceeded to leverage the team as a means to get big real estate projects and land developments done. To him, owning a football team was only meant to accentuate his business future. And thus, in 1996, after seeing the Seattle Mariners get a new stadium and realizing he was stuck in the Kingdome until 2005, Ken Behring wanted to move the Seahawks to California, and in fact did succeed in moving their headquarters there, but the staff refused to move when the trucks loaded the equipment, and there was quite a standoff, at least for that day. Eventually, there were court hearings and other things, and Ken Behring said there were earthquake concerns with the Kingdome, and that he believed he had the right to break the lease, but a judge ruled against that, realizing he would have to keep the team in Seattle until 2005 when the lease with the Kingdome was up. He looked for someone to buy the team. This brings in Seattle's third and current owner in Paul Allen. Paul Allen stepped in rather quietly. There was almost no fanfare about it. When he finally did agree to speak in front of a camera, it was with the understanding that the people would approve a new stadium measure for the Seahawks. After this, though, Paul Allen also said that he would do everything in his power to bring the team back up to the standard they had enjoyed from the early to mid-'80s under Chuck Knox. He spent a good deal of money doing so, and in '98 he brought in many stars and spent a good deal of money, but eventually, after a 7-9 lackluster season, Dennis Erickson, the current coach at the time he bought the team, was let go because he didn't make the playoffs. And Paul Allen went about paying the most lucrative contract to a head coach ever at the time in Mike Holmgren. Mike Holmgren in '99 was looking to expand his horizons as a football man. He wanted to put the groceries buy the groceries, I should say, rather. He wanted to buy the groceries, do all the stuff. And in order to do that, Paul Allen agreed not just to pay him $8 million a year, which at the time was unheard of. He also agreed to give him every key to every door in the building. Essentially, I believe Mike Holmgren at one point was head janitor and head man of the concession stands. You can't tell me a guy goes from a healthy 240, 250 to 325 all because, he's coaching really hard. He had keys to some very important rooms. So, all this goes off, and about 4 years into this decision, it's clear that Mike Holmgren can't handle all of the duties of GM, vice president, football operations, and other things. So Paul Allen relieves him of those duties. This kind of creates a rift, and now Mike Holmgren, who believes, he's still the smartest man in the room, there's a lot of antagonism. Bob Whitsitt, who was key in bringing in Paul Allen and helping him sort of pilot the organization, becomes the GM in 2003. He follows that up by replacing Bob Whitsitt in the 2004 season with Bob Ferguson, an NBA man who'd never really done anything in football whatsoever at any level. And that wound up being a big disaster for Seattle. And so this time, he and now President Todd Leiweke, this being Paul Allen, decided to go out and address Seattle's constant and consistent poor defense that had been a problem since Holmgren had kind of eviscerated the roster following the '99 campaign. So they did a broad search, and they came up with Tim Ruskell, a man who'd worked under Rich McKay in Atlanta and built, some pretty decent defenses. Had participated in that. He hadn't actually made any of the decisions. Ruskell was a head of scouting for Rich McKay and had worked quite closely with him. So he comes to Seattle, and basically all resources are spent in the beginning of the 2005 season completely retooling the defense. Then 2005 happens, and everybody thinks, the disaster that is, the antagonistic relationship of Holmgren of the last 2 years, not having the GM job, and, not being as big a powerhouse in the front office. This is all behind us. All that drama is gone. Unfortunately, what happens next is Ruskell makes a flub. In an attempt to save about $3 million a year and force Hutchinson to stay at a more then Pro Bowl guard Steve Hutchinson wanted about $10 million. And knowing that Seattle wouldn't give it to him, he decided with his agent to collude so that he could go to Minnesota, and Seattle would either have to match the contract and pay him $10 million a year, or they would have to let him go to Minnesota. Feeling completely disrespected by the process and completely inept front offices over the last couple of years, Tim Ruskell walked into a disaster with a bunch of players just not liking anything that was done. Darrell Jackson was disgruntled. Several other players just felt like they weren't respected. and certain other players felt like they were also cheated out of certain bonus money. Though some details are sketchy and are only word of mouth from the player themselves. So all of this drama happens all the way through 2006. Most fans don't focus on it, but then something amazing happens as the team enters the 2008 season. Holmgren, obviously tired, obviously unable to deal with the politics and feeling like he can't make the decisions on personnel, is pretty much on his way out. The big thing here is that Ruskell decides with Paul Allen and with Todd Lewicki that they'll go ahead and recruit in-house. They had brought in Jim Mora in the 2007 season after he was fired by Atlanta for some comments he made where he would leave the team if the Huskies came calling. And this wasn't the entire reason, but it certainly showed a lack of maturity on Jim Mora's part. So he comes to Seattle and gets recruited on as the assistant head coach, and then Tim Ruskell names him as the next head coach of the Seattle Seahawks after Holmgren finishes the 2008 season. So the drama doesn't stop. And eventually, if you look at this move from a perspective of all of the background I've just shared, Ruskell's recruiting of Jim Mora had all of the fingerprints of needing a guy who he'd spent time with in Atlanta, knew pretty well, had a pretty good background with, and was trying to repair the head coach general manager relationship that was so strained after the Hutchinson deal. But really, it didn't do that. And as 2008 drew to a close, and then 2009 saw the team spend money on guys like TJ Hushmanzada, and it became clear that the team was lagging behind. The roster had aged. Disaster was happening. Jim Mora turned out not to have a good handle on the organization. The team looked utterly rudderless and just in a bad position. So, Paul Allen, being the guy he was, and faced with a decision, as Tim Ruskell said he either wanted an extension or he would resign, decided to move forward without Tim Ruskell, and then, according to some reports, went to Mike Holmgren to offer him the position of GM. Though I'm not sure that that's actually true, or I'm not sure how deep those talks went. There was a letter released by the team after Ruskell was let go that was a few weeks later, or I'm trying to remember exactly when it was, but I know that the team released a letter about having conversations about Mike Holmgren either returning to some job in the organization of some kind, or, at least assuring them that there were conversations had between them and Seattle's then most successful coach. The one thing I can say is that once Ruskell left, it left Jim Mora taking all the bullets for all of the mistakes made after the 2005 season, which weren't all his fault, but he didn't handle them well, and as the season progressed, he proceeded to blame the team, blame the team's position, blame Chris Spencer for a game in which he fumbled the snap a couple of times because of a broken pinky. I mean, it was probably the worst train wreck of a disaster that I've ever seen, and it wound up costing Paul Allen about $12 million to fix that entire mess. So then after all of this, after all of the drama, after all of the disaster and all of the Mike Holmgren wanting to be GM and not really being happy after he was removed, Paul Allen makes a very strange decision. They go down, and I believe it was Todd Lewicki that went down to speak to Pete Carroll. He wanted to see where Pete was, and then I believe they brought in Paul in secret. But I believe that Todd Lewicki, it was easy to find him if the media had been looking. But I think Paul Allen met with Pete Carroll in secret in California. And I also believe that had Pete Carroll turned them down, that Jim Mora would have remained head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. What's interesting is that they spent 3 days, the entire weekend, speaking to Pete about the job in Seattle and what they wanted to offer him. And, the eventual decision was that Pete Carroll would come in and basically be able to do what he wanted in the organization, that he would have roster control and final say over players and certain things. And he would also sit in on the interview process of the general manager's job, which is pretty much unheard of in the modern NFL. This didn't even sit well with fans at the time. Most fans, when they heard the name Pete Carroll, thought, here's a guy that was 500 at best in the NFL, and Jim Mora wasn't much worse than that. So why would you replace Jim Mora with another, mediocre coach? So the announcement of Pete Carroll was really followed by fans being mortified, angry, or confused. There was a lot of talk about why it was. Pete's career track record, mediocre. Pete had been hired as before the GM, and had fans who read that and followed the dysfunction of, Mike Holmgren's whole mess, were just understandably at a loss. The word constantly used by John Morgan at Field Goals during this transition was process. The overall mood of the diehards at this time was that the process was bad, and many fans who'd endured the tinkering by Paul Allen when it came to the Portland Trailblazers were seeing all the warning signs of that happening with the Seahawks. And we were just set for a huge organizational explosion. That was the feeling even before John Schneider stepped into the door or Pete Carroll had coached a game for the Seahawks. John Schneider was announced as GM, and for those around at the time, remember Mike Salk at 710 ESPN, who didn't like Pete much in terms of his coaching background, basically walking people through the entire process of looking at these GMs, who was in and out of Pete's office, how long did they stay there. It was pretty much like TMZ for football fans. It was very interesting, and John Clayton probably got more work in that. I believe it was 3-week process than any other time. Speaking on Seattle. And speaking of Pete and Mike Salk's experience with Pete was everything Mike Salk described as he covered him in New England. The majority of the voices were not for Pete or John Schneider. In fact, the only voice that spoke highly of Carroll at all was former player Lawyer Malloy. But the drama didn't stop. Jim Mora was making the radio rounds at the time and seemed to say off mic during an interview with Dave Softy Mahler that Pete Carroll cheats. This was a view of a lot of fans in Seattle and a lot of fans around the league, and even fans that want to hate him now believe that Pete Carroll cheated at USC and continues to cheat in Seattle. But the drama wouldn't stop there. Now came the roster moves. As Pete and John began their process of deconstructing the roster and finding value where they could, the first major blow-up was a trade of Darryl Tapp for a fourth-round selection and an injured and unknown outside linebacker in Chris Clements. Fans around the net and here on Field Goals at the time felt that Tapp was on the verge of a breakout season. The next chip to fall was Rob Sims, and this one, it had staying power because he had a good couple of seasons following his time in Seattle in Detroit. The one that left fans just scratching their heads was when Seattle traded Josh Wilson for a conditional 4th or 5th round selection. This hit even the casual Seahawks fans who liked him and saw him as a playmaker. This was after a preseason game where Josh had impressively tipped a pass to a rookie Earl Thomas, who had returned it for a pick 6 against the Vikings. Never mind a confusing trade for Charlie Whitehurst and a 3rd-round pick. There was just no equity from fans who had no faith in what they were seeing so far. The roster was a speeding, revolving door as Pete and John tried to find players who could play, bringing in veterans like Raheem Brock and Brandon Stokely. They even sat down with 16-year veteran Lawyer Malloy and asked if he would be willing to be more of a starter. It was a mishmash of parts that made up the 2010 roster. The one move that got the media's attention, though, was a trade for Lendale White, a big running back who Pete had a history with at USC, which stoked the flames of every player who plays at USC Pete wants, quote unquote. The story there was White only lasted a few practices before being let go. Ray Roberts spoke on 710 ESPN at the time of the release on the Brock and Salk show, saying, "Man, he was pulling every veteran move he could to miss drills, tying his shoes, tucking in his jersey. It was clear he wasn't giving effort." This would later be pointed to as a key to getting players to buy in at the time. It was seen as a waste, though, by fans immediately after. Mike Williams, a former first-round selection, would live in some obscurity despite some mentions of his second chance. Marshawn Lynch was hit or miss for his first season, except for his 67-yard playoff run. There were other notable roster decisions like the signing of Michael Robinson and the addition of Leon Washington in a draft day trade with the Jets. And for the most part, the season started out pretty well, with the Seahawks finishing their first 6 games with a strong 4-2 record, with a road victory against the Bears, where their biggest project, reclaiming Red Bryant and making him into an elephant defensive end, had a huge impact on their 6 sacks logged against Jay Cutler and the Bears. However, this great game by Red Bryant would then be followed up by an unfortunate knee injury against the Oakland Raiders the very next week. Seattle would lose 4 of their next 5 and 7 of their next 10 games. This would cause people to think Pete's mediocre and the team's bad and we just were playing bad teams early in the season, and there was no leeway. There was a lot of negativity and a lot of bad feeling. However, when Seattle had the chance to make the playoffs at the end of the year, playing the St. Louis Rams on a Monday night game, or no, it was Sunday night. Excuse me. Um, a lot of fans were actually behind the idea of them going to the playoffs. Despite a lot of people believing that we needed help in the draft, a lot of them wanted to go to the playoffs. A lot of them thought it was still a good thing. The majority of the people on the radio were saying, let's go to the playoffs. Let's see what happens. And Charlie Whitehurst was able to have one of his few moments in Seattle and throw a awesome pass to Mike Williams on a crossing pattern for a touchdown, and essentially do enough not to lose the game. Matt Hasselbeck would then finish the year with a phenomenal game against the Saints, a game in which I actually wrote these words: Be careful what people tell you about Seattle against the Saints. Matt Hasselbeck has faced Greg Williams, the Saints' current defensive coordinator, at least 6 times that I can recall. And his stat line is pretty solid. 1,200 yards, 11 touchdowns, and just 3 interceptions in all of his games against Greg Williams. He'd also put up a phenomenal amount of numbers against the Saints earlier that season. So, in the final analysis of the game, a lot of people should have seen this coming, but they didn't. The game itself holds a big mark in Pete Carroll's history here, but remarkably doesn't actually absolve him of a lot of the negativity. It actually follows him into the 2011 season. People still didn't really buy into Pete despite the playoff win and despite sort of the resiliency of his football team. The 2011 draft, which was a little bit of a head scratcher with guys like KJ Wright being drafted, guys we didn't know anything about. Fans were just mostly unimpressed. James Carpenter was their first round pick. And so there just still wasn't a lot of equity. They re-signed Raheem Brock for a little bit. They went out and got Alan Branch. They added Anthony Hargrove. And then they added a guy out of the CFL in Brandon Browner, a 6'4", 230 corner who'd put up all-pro honors in the CFL and was quite well thought of. They then added a 5th-round corner in Richard Sherman. And they added a couple of undrafted free agents. One guy that's a key mention here is Doug Baldwin. Another is Jerron Johnson. What fails to be recognized, though, and almost completely forgotten when you mention the 2011 season, is that there was a lockout on. And so Seattle, who I think fundamentally had really decided they wanted to move on from Matt Hasselbeck, now were in a situation where they weren't really sure what to do, what their best option was. And once they decided to pull the trigger on moving forward from Matt Hasselbeck and replacing him with Tavares Jackson, as they replaced replaced Jeremy Bates, who'd been their offensive coordinator in 2010, with Tavares Jackson's offensive coordinator in Darrell Bevell, a lot of fans just threw up their hands and said, that's it, he's tanking the season, on and on and on. People just weren't excited. Even though Seattle had gone out and signed some key free agents, they kept Mike Williams for another season. They went out and signed Zach Miller. They went out and signed Sidney Rice, and then they got Robert Gallery to try and shore up their left guard situation. Boy, do we know something about that. But just all the moves, no equity, no excitement, no real nothing about this. Pete Carroll still taking bullets. There was even a story that John Schneider had drafted guys that Pete didn't want. Yahoo Sports said they were at odds. Then they actually right the week after this article came out, they gave a press conference saying it's all crazy, it's all dumb, they don't know what they're talking about. Essentially, like for 2 weeks after that, you couldn't find John Schneider and Pete Carroll separated by maybe more than a few feet quite often. Obviously, to signal that they were closer than what was being implied at the time. However, it didn't help that all of this didn't turn much around for Seattle, as they started their season pretty weakly. They started the season with 2 losses in a row. They won a game, lost a game, won a game, and then lost 3 in a row. And after the 3rd loss in a row, I remember Pete Carroll's reaction. People were wondering how they could keep it together, how things were going, what the destiny of the season was. And Pete Carroll said these words, and I'll always remember them for the way he presented them. Because unlike Mike Holmgren, who might say, this is about your stars got to step up, you got to change things, you got to refocus your efforts. He'd say something, just kind of bland. But Pete said something really that kind of hit me in a very strange way at the time. He said, we have to realize that we're okay, that we're doing the right things, that we're focused on the right things, that the work we're doing means something, and we're just a bounce here or there away from it going our way. You had a tough loss against Cleveland, a rough loss at home against the Bengals, and then a bigger and tougher loss against the Cowboys. But the season wasn't a total loss, because after that game, after the game in Dallas, this is where Marshawn Lynch began to fully turn it around. He started to understand Tom Cable's zone running system, and this was after he reportedly went to Tom Cable and said, now show me what you want, because he clearly, at the time, wasn't getting it. This led to a surge a little bit in winning and more effective play. They won 5 of their next 6 games, losing their final game against the 49ers and losing a tough one against the Redskins. Those 2 games alone, had outcomes changed, they may have been able to make the playoffs, though I don't remember the entire schedule shakeout. But I just remember the season of 2011 starting really tough and fans not really getting into it. And then that end of the year surge, and they started to see guys like Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman, KJ Wright. A lot of these guys started to come on and play well. Chris Clemens was having a hell of a second year. There was just a lot to be excited about, but Pete Carroll still didn't have the quarterback. Fans still didn't have much faith in the dynamic yet, and just generally there wasn't much to think of on this season in terms of how next year would shake out. And so, in my second look in on this piece, I will cover both 2012 and 2013, and we'll go from there, and we'll see how this all turns out for the Seattle Seahawks. Okay, thanks.